When importing photographs, one of the important options to consider is your render preview. Now, as I mentioned, you can open up the file handling panel and you can view your render previews. There are four options here: minimal, embedded and sidecar, standard, and one-to-one. So what I want to do here is navigate to a slide which will help us demystify how to actually work with previews. All right, well, one of the things that we need to consider in regards to previews in the import dialog is which option is best. As I mentioned, there are four options. And what I like to do is I like to think of these options as speed versus quality. The first two options really have to do with speed. Minimal and embedded in sidecar basically means that it will use a JPEG preview, either a really small preview or a JPEG that's embedded in the raw file. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, in certain situations, let's say you're shooting raw images, and let's say you're a wedding photographer, and you just shot 1,000 images and you're at the wedding. What you want to do is import these files into Lightroom, go through them really quickly, select 50 for a slideshow that you're going to play at the wedding. Well, in that particular case, you don't need a super accurate preview. You just want to quickly view the image and access the file and make some quick decisions and then put together a slideshow. So in those cases, minimal or embedded in sidecar would work really well because you're prioritizing speed. Now, what's the downside to this? Well, the preview isn't going to be a very accurate representation of the raw file. So if you're interested in accuracy or in quality, you're going to choose one of the latter two options, either standard or one-to-one. And what these options will do is necessitate that Lightroom renders or creates a preview based on the raw information. In other words, Lightroom is going to dig into the raw file and say, okay, hey, what's there? All right, because of what I'm seeing here, I'm going to then create this preview so it's a little bit more accurate. Now then, a lot of people say, okay, well, out of these four options, which is typically best? For the most part, it's going to be standard or one-to-one. And out of those two, which is best? Well, really, that's a question that's contingent upon hardware. In other words, what camera are you using? How fast is your computer? In my particular case, I'm shooting with a Canon 5D Mark II, and I have a pretty fast computer. Yet that being said, I choose standard because I find with my camera, because it's generating such a large file, if I use one-to-one, it should take so long to render that preview that it's not really worthwhile. Now that being said, if I were using an older camera that was capturing a file that was a little bit smaller, well then I may choose that one-to-one option. So what you're going to need to do is to experiment a little bit in regards to your overall workflow and see which option works best for you. Now, one of the things that we need to define is if we're going to choose standard, how big is that preview going to actually be? Well, we can define that in our catalog settings dialog. You'll notice here that in the import dialog, we have file handling. We have the same option in our catalog settings. We also have the preview as standard. We have the same option over here, standard preview size. So the nice thing about this is that what we can do is we can define how big we want this standard preview size to be. You notice that currently it's 1440. In other words, it's a pretty high-res file, but it's not super big. Now we can change this. We can increase or decrease this amount by simply clicking on this drop-down menu here. Now what you may want to do is choose a little bit of a larger preview if you're using a higher resolution monitor. If it's a smaller resolution monitor, like a small little laptop, perhaps you're going to choose even a smaller size. We have one more option here that's kind of important, and it has to do with our preview quality. So let's say we define our size. Well, what's the quality of the preview? We have high, medium, or low. Now the thing to keep in mind in regards to these options is that the high option is going to generate a preview based on the ProPhoto color space, whereas medium and low are going to generate a preview based on the Adobe RGB color space. Now you may be thinking, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, basically, if you choose high, that preview is going to be a little bit more accurate. It's going to have more access to a wider gamut or a wider array of colors and tones. And so typically, what happens when you're working on a computer is if you choose high, it means a larger file size, which means your computer may run a little bit more slowly. Well, in this particular case, the trade-off is well worth it because it is just a preview. It's not like a huge file that it's rendering. It's worth it to have that high setting turned on so that you have a much more accurate preview, which then makes that preview more relevant to your overall workflow process. All right, well, now that we've seen some of these options, let's go ahead and navigate back to Lightroom. And in Lightroom, what I'm going to do is cancel out of the import dialog here, and I'm going to navigate to my catalog settings. I'm going to go ahead and choose Lightroom and then catalog settings. On a PC, you can find those settings in the Edit pull-down menu. This will then open up the catalog settings dialog. There are 3 tabs. If you click on File Handling, you have the option to choose your standard preview size, in this case 1440 pixels, or you can go higher or lower. Now, because the resolution of the monitor I'm working on is actually a little bit lower than I typically would use, I'm just going to leave it on this 1440 size. Preview quality, though, I'm taking up to high because I want a really nice preview so I can actually evaluate the image a little bit more effectively. Now, in an ideal world, it would be great to keep our one-to-one previews, and we can create those either as we're working on our images or upon import. Yet the reality is that these files get to be pretty big, and so you may want to choose an option to discard those after a certain amount of time. You're going to want to choose the option that makes sense in your own workflow. If you have access to a ton of hard drive storage space and you're not really worried about it, well, choose never. In other situations, you're going to want to probably discard these after a certain amount of time once you know that you're not going to really need access to those. In my particular case, I just leave it on the default after 30 days, and that's tended to work well in my own workflow. All right, well, now that we've been introduced to the import dialog and some of our options and preferences, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can actually import files so that we can begin to work on them in Lightroom. And let's go ahead and do that in the next movie.